In 1994, a ranching family moved onto a 480-acre property in northeastern Utah. Shortly after arriving, they noticed something unusual about the house. Several of the doors had heavy metal bolts and chains installed on the inside, not on the outside. The previous owners had also given them a very specific warning before leaving. They told them to always keep the doors and windows locked at night. At the time, the warning didn't seem important. But within days of moving in, the family began experiencing a series of events that didn't match anything they had encountered before. It started with their animals behaving unpredictably, then progressed into direct encounters with something on the property that didn't behave like any known animal. Over the next few months, those encounters became frequent enough that the family made a decision to leave the ranch entirely. But what makes this case different is what happened after they left. Because the next people who took over the property didn't just move in, they investigated it. This is Kryptic Works, and tonight, we're starting with what the family experienced before that investigation began. The ranch was located in the Uinta Basin, a remote area in northeastern Utah known for its wide-open land and low population. The property covered hundreds of acres and included grazing fields, fenced livestock areas, and sections of trees and brush along the edges of the land. The family who moved there expected a normal ranching life. They brought cattle, horses, and several dogs, and began settling into a routine almost immediately. During the first few days, everything seemed normal. The animals behaved as expected, there were no signs of predators, and nothing unusual stood out. That changed within the first week. The first signs came from the dogs. At night, the dogs would suddenly become alert and run toward specific areas along the fence line. They would bark continuously into the darkness, focused on something that the family couldn't see. This behavior repeated over several nights, often in the same locations. When the family followed them, they expected to find a predator nearby. But each time they checked, the area was empty. There were no visible animals, no movement, and no sounds that could explain what the dogs were reacting to. Around the same time, the cattle began behaving differently. Instead of spreading out across the field, they would cluster tightly together, often facing outward as if reacting to something surrounding them. This kind of behavior is typically seen when animals sense danger, but in this case, there was no visible threat. The family also began hearing movement at night. The sounds came from outside the house, usually along the perimeter of the property. They described it as footsteps or something moving steadily across the ground. Each time they went outside to check, they found nothing. There were no tracks, no animals, and no clear source of the noise. Then one afternoon, the family saw something near their livestock. At first, they thought it was a wolf, which would not have been unusual for that area. But as it moved closer, they realized it was much larger than a normal wolf. Its behavior was also different from anything they had seen before. Instead of keeping its distance, it walked directly toward the fenced area where the cattle were kept. The animals reacted immediately by pulling away and grouping together, but the wolf did not attempt to chase them. One of the family members began walking toward the animal, expecting it to run once he got close enough. But it didn't move. It remained in place and continued watching him. He kept approaching, getting closer than he should have been able to with any wild predator. Even at that distance, the animal did not show fear, aggression, or any sign that it was about to leave. The encounter lasted long enough for the family to realize that this was not normal behavior. The animal was not acting like it was hunting, and it was not acting like it was avoiding humans. Eventually, it turned and walked away, but not in a way that suggested panic or urgency. It left at a steady pace, the same way it had approached. After that encounter, The activity on the ranch became more consistent. The family began seeing large shapes at the edges of the property, usually near tree lines or fence boundaries. These sightings were brief, but repeated often enough to be noticeable. The shapes were too far away to clearly identify, but they were large enough that they could not be ignored. At the same time, small changes began happening around the ranch. Gates that had been closed were found open the next morning. Tools that had been left in specific places were no longer there. Objects appeared to have been moved without any clear explanation. In some cases, the family found tracks in the dirt that suddenly stopped, with no continuation in any direction. Individually, these events could have been explained, but together they formed a pattern that the family could not account for. One night, the dogs reacted more aggressively than they had before. They ran toward an area of the property and continued barking for an extended period of time. This time, the family followed immediately instead of waiting. By the time they reached the area, everything had gone quiet. The dogs were gone. They searched the area and eventually found evidence that the dogs had been attacked. The scene didn't match what they would expect from a normal predator. There were signs of an attack, but not the kind of struggle or movement patterns that usually occur in those situations. For the family, this was a turning point. Up to that point, the events had been unusual but manageable. Now it felt like something on the property was becoming more aggressive. Not long after that, the family discovered something unusual involving their cattle. Some of the animals had been affected in a way they could not explain. There were no clear signs of a predator attack, no evidence of a struggle, and no indication of what had caused it. This did not match any known predator behavior, and it did not fit with anything the family had experienced before. At this point, the situation had escalated beyond something they could ignore. As time went on, the activity did not stop. The sightings continued. The animals remained uneasy. The disturbances around the ranch kept happening. The family also began noticing that the activity was not random. It seemed to occur in the same areas and follow similar patterns. According to their later accounts, the overall feeling of the property changed. It no longer felt like an empty piece of land. It felt like something was present there on a regular basis. There was no clear explanation for what they were experiencing, but the pattern had become consistent enough that they could no longer ignore it.
Eventually, the family made a decision. They left the ranch. They sold the property and moved away. Later, they would share parts of what they had experienced, but even then, many details remained unclear. There was no single explanation that could account for everything they reported. But after they left, the story did not end. In fact, that is when it began to draw serious attention. Because the next people who took over the property were not just interested in living there, they wanted to document what was happening. They brought in researchers, they installed cameras and monitoring equipment, and they began recording activity on the ranch. What they found was not random. It was repeatable, and in some cases, it was captured on camera.